Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jake Edwards, the Assistant Consumer Advocate at the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs. Today, we're going to go over the basics to understanding your power bill. We're hoping this can serve as a resource to customers that need help understanding their bill or customers that may not have the time to understand what every charge means. We're not going to cover everything, but this is going to be a fairly in-depth overview, and we're going to mostly walk through charges and where you can find items on your bill. This presentation is not meant to serve as a substitute for reading the various laws discussed, seeking legal counsel, or otherwise requesting department guidance and/or interpretations on the law it administers and enforces. This presentation merely serves as an introduction and overview. Today, we're going to get a brief introduction on the Department of Consumer Affairs, as well as our advocacy division. Then we're going to walk through a Duke Carolina's bill example and possible ways to save money on your bill. Then we're going to go over a more unique billing structure called demand charges that you may have seen or heard about lately. Then we're going to wrap things up and open the floor to questions. And we have walked through Dominion previously, but there are some differences between that and what we're going to discuss today. If you're a Dominion customer, you can find that prior walkthrough on the department's YouTube, but we did receive feedback after that from our viewers to walk through a Duke bill. So that's what we're planning on doing today. Before we get into our role and bills overview, I want to just give you a brief overview of South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs. We were created when the Consumer Protection Code was adopted in 1974, and we are the state's consumer protection agency. We were initially created to take consumer complaints, regulate consumer credit marketplace, and intervene in certain rate-making actions. We have 46 full-time employees, and we have one office located at 293 Greystone Boulevard, which is right by the zoo. And we have about 120 statutes to administer and enforce, along with the accompanying regulations, and that includes Title 37, which is the South Carolina Consumer Protection Code. So our mission is to protect consumers in the marketplace through advocacy, mediation, enforcement, and education. And there are a variety of ways the department can assist you. You can file a complaint. If another agency handles it, we can help get you to the right place. Otherwise, we can assist through a voluntary mediation process. You can also report a scam and identity theft, and we'll work to provide guidance and educational materials to consumers to help them limit their ongoing losses and help prevent it from happening again. You may also have background in business. We regulate consumer credit generally across about 15 industries. You can check to make sure folks have the right licenses. You can see interest rates and certain fees, and you can also search complaints. We also do free presentations. We believe education is a core component of our mission, and we'll do these with businesses and consumers alike. What we're doing today is an example of one of the presentations we might give. And we can also answer your questions. We get about 25,000 calls to our main number per year, and we'll create publications on money and credit, dealing with debt, computer and privacy, and scams generally. And here's just a slide with our website, and it shows you how to get assistance with these issues. You just click the drop down, navigate to where you need to go, and we can hopefully provide you assistance if we're able. This provides you an organizational structure for the department. Advocacy is just the division that handles Public Service Commission matters. I'm one of the attorneys in advocacy, and I'm the Assistant Consumer Advocate. The advocacy division has several responsibilities. Primarily, it's rate making with the utilities and insurance, but we also do rulemaking, which involves submitting comment letters for proposed federal regulations and participating in the state regulation process. We also do some miscellaneous tasks, such as the State Health Planning Committee, but most of our focus is on rate making, and we focus on the consumer interest, which I'm going to go over some on this slide. This slide just gives you the actual statutory language that revived our utility role. And this, again, this is where we spend the most time. I'm not going to read the statute in its entirety, but we focus on the consumer interest in matters or cases that impact rates. Now, the statute doesn't define consumer interest, but we interpret consumer in accordance with the Consumer Protections Code to mean South Carolina residents who purchase utility services primarily for personal, family, or household use. And this means residential consumers as a whole. The advocacy division is not allowed to represent individual consumers at matters at the Public Service Commission. And real quick, before we get into bills, let's just go over utility rate making and the parties involved generally. These are going to be the primary entities involved: the Public Service Commission, or PSC, investor-owned utilities, also could be called public utilities or IOUs, the Office of Regulatory Staff, which we generally refer to as ORS, our department, Consumer Affairs, which we'll call DCA, and then other interveners. So for background, electric, gas, and water utilities are going to be granted monopoly service territory, and that means they have no natural competitors within their region. Now, the theory behind this is it prevents duplication of investment in plant. It allows for larger and more efficient equipment. It also results in lower average costs, helping to minimize rates. The monopoly is given in exchange for an obligation to serve, which just means dedicated to public use, reasonable rates, and non-discriminatory practices. And they're subject to regulation, and the regulation is intended to replace the free market. Part of that regulation involves having to submit rates and other requests for review and approval by the Public Service Commission. Now, in South Carolina, our main electric investor-owned utilities are going to be Duke Energy Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress, Dominion Energy, and Lockhart Power Company. These investor-owned utilities are going to need PSC approval to set new rates. And in general, they're going to be subject to more regulation at the Public Service Commission than a co-op or a municipality. Now, some examples of co-ops may be Central, Aiken, or Blue Ridge Electric Cooperatives, and the PSC and ORS do have some oversight over co-ops, such as the ability to inspect and audit all cooperatives, but generally the co-ops are going to be self-governing entities. For municipalities, it's very limited what jurisdiction the PSC and ORS have. And an example of a municipal electric is the Piedmont Municipal Power Agency, which is a collection of about 10 towns in the upstate and includes towns like Westminster and Union. So now with that background out of the way and our role at the PSC explained, we're going to move into the walkthrough part of the presentation. And I'm going to warn you in advance that this may get somewhat technical and there's going to be a little jargon that's going to be thrown your way. Hopefully, I'm going to explain these terms in a way that's understandable, but please ask questions in any time in the chat. We have allotted time after the presentation to answer questions. If you end up stumping me, my email is going to be displayed at the end of the presentation. You can feel free to shoot me an email with your question, and we'll work to get you an answer if we can in a reasonable amount of time. Again, this presentation's recording is also going to be available on the department's YouTube. So if you don't understand something, you can always go there and rewind and try and pick up on what you missed. Our last presentation, again, focused on the Dominion bill and can be found on that YouTube. And this bill, our presentation is going to focus more on the Duke Carolinas bill, which is for upstate customers. Now, there's also a Duke Progress, and that's a PD region, and there might be some differences between that and what we're about to go over. So for starters, the best way to start to understand your bill is with a copy of your bill. This is a copy of a bill for a Duke Carolinas customer for the month of February. And like I said, Duke's an investor-owned utility, or IOU. So there's going to be differences if you're a co-op customer, a municipal customer, or a customer of a different IOU like Dominion. But ultimately, the generic items should be relatively similar. Now, when you get your bill, I want you to first look at these two important items, and that's going to be your current amount due and when it's due, and your monthly kilowatt hour usage. And for starters, we're going to start with the billing summary, which shows you what's due. So here you're going to see your previous month's payment, and you're also going to see kind of how your bill's varying month to month. Now, your bill's going to vary month to month unless you're enrolled in budget billing. Generally, weather is going to be the largest driver of these variations. I also think here, and I've highlighted this top right box, that's very important and helpful to double check the service states for billing. If your bill seems high and you remember a lot of really hot or really cold days in that period, that could be a reason. And then we're going to jump back here. And if you have gas charges, you might also see those in this portion of the bill. Now, I want to also use this as an opportunity to briefly discuss budget billing. Budget billing can be a really convenient program to help you plan out your bills per month and should prevent some of the higher peaks in your billing cycle. Generally, you need to be a customer at the residence for 12 months. It's going to recalculate every 12 months. If you overpay in a 12-month cycle, it's going to provide a credit to the next 12-month cycle. But if you underpaid during the cycle, you're either going to have to pay the difference in full or add it to the recalculated budget billing number for the next 12 months. And Duke actually also offers a quarterly budget billing plan, and that does not require billing history. And it's going to operate very similarly to annual, but it's just going to work in 3-month intervals. And now I want to jump into what I mentioned as the second most important item to look for in your bill, and that's your usage numbers, which are going to be displayed in kilowatt hours. So here you'll see that this customer used 955 kilowatt hours for the month of February and doesn't have a prior February for us to compare to. If you do have that prior February, you can use that as a rough check to make sure things are working how you expect them to. But any changes could be due to any number of factors. For instance, you could have new appliances, you could have new residents in the house, you might have taken more vacations in that month the year before, but most of the time it's just going to be weather dependent. And your average resident is going to use somewhere between 1,000 to 1,255 kilowatt hours, but your personal average is shown on the bill right here. If you've seen any notices of proposed rate increases from your utility, then these proposed bill increases are generally based around your 1,000 kilowatt hour user, though keep an eye out and just double check to see if it's based on a different number. You can use that and use your number here and work back and see your bill impact. And if you focus on this number monthly, it can kind of let you know if you need to consider energy efficiency measures to reduce your bill. Sometimes a single appliance can really drive this up, and we'll go over some of that later. And lastly, I just want to go over a few miscellaneous items that are here, just so we cover everything on this first page of the bill. And that would, I want to start with the late payment charge and when the balance is subject to this charge, which is right down here in this lower box. Here you can see the late charge is applied if I go past March 21st, which is roughly a month after the due date. For Duke and Dominion, this late charge is 1.5% applied to any balance. Per statute, this is the maximum allowable late fee for an investor-owned utility. And then the last thing I want to point out is this upper box right here, which I'm circling. This is just information to go to Duke's website where they sell some energy efficiency devices and appliances. I'd recommend checking it out. There may be some deals available, and we'll discuss later how this is part of your bill. And with that, we're going to move into some of the individual items, but I want to start with what a rate plan and what a tariff is. So here you can see right up here where I have this arrow, you can see your current rate is residential service electric, RE. This is referred to as a rate plan or tariff. If you're a Dominion customer, you're most likely going to be on rate 8 for residential service. With Duke Carolinas, you're probably going to be RS and not this RE, though they're generally going to look very similar. RS is just your standard residential rate. And you can, excuse me. You can look on your website for your utility or through a Google search like Duke Carolinas residential rate. And you should get a Google result that takes you to the rates and tariffs pages of their website. We're going to go over the RS tariff when we're explaining some of these items in your bill, just because it's going to be the most common, and it's generally going to go into more detail on what certain charges in your bill. With that, we're going to walk into some of these items on this table. So first, we have the basic customer charge component of your bill, may also be called the basic facilities charge or BFC. No matter the name though, every bill is likely to have some sort of similar charge. And this is going to be a fixed charge in your bill. For investor-owned utilities, it's not going to change absent Public Service Commission approval in a general rate case. And as a residential customer, you have no control or ability to minimize this charge. It's going to be the same whether you're using 100 kilowatt hours or 2000 kilowatt hours. And now that we know that this isn't going to change, I'm sure some of you guys are wondering what the purpose of this charge is. And this basic customer charge is just intended to cover expenses necessary to maintain the overall electric system. And again, it's regardless of usage. And when I say overall electric system, this is your critical infrastructure like your power lines, transformers, and substations that are necessary to supply power. Next, we have your usage or energy charge. And this is going to be a variable charge. And that just means it's going to change month to month depending on your kilowatt hour usage. This is what your meter is going to be keeping track of. Generally, you're going to be seeing your kilowatt hour usage multiplied by these rates, which are in the tariff. And in that tariff and rate plan, you may also see some of the costs that make up that energy or usage charge. And just keep in mind that this is the charge where you as the customer can create savings in your bill by attempting to be more energy efficient. If this number shocks you with how high it is, or if it's unusually high, you may want to consider looking into the cause of the issue. For instance, maybe you ran space heaters all night to keep warm. That could be a reason your bill's high. Sorry. You may also call the utility and see if everything was calculated or the meter was read properly. And with Duke and Dominion, this is going to change after a first certain amount of kilowatt hour used. For Dominion, that's 800. For Duke Carolinas, it's 1000. So please keep an eye out in your bills for that, depending on your utility. And before we jump back into the rest of that table, I do want to go over fuel costs a little bit. Fuel costs are a large part of your energy costs. Generally, a certain amount is going to be included within the energy charge, and that's going to represent the fuel used to produce the electricity that the customers have used. It's going to include a little bit more than what you might think of as fuel. It can include the cost of chemicals used to reduce emissions and the cost of emission allowances, which if you've heard of cap and trade, that's an example of an emission allowance. These costs will generally pass through to customers upon commission approval and defining that the costs are just and reasonable. These are merely pass-through costs, which means the utility does not earn a profit on its fuel, but it just gets recovery of the cost of fuel and possibly some interest amounts associated with that. And here I've also given you some quick data on gas prices. Rising gas prices have had a fairly significant fuel cost impact in the last couple of years. And these gas prices are going to impact you as either an electric or gas customer because you're likely going to be receiving power from a gas plant. And as you can see, there's been an upward trend in these last 2 years on this half of the graph. And you can see that that's generally coincided with the bill increases. And generally the spikes are inclement winter weather. So with that, we're going to jump right back into this table that appears on the last page of your bill. And we're going to talk about this LEAF 50C charge. So this is a fixed charge, and it's related to and intended to cover the costs of distributed energy resources. And we'll call it DERP, which is just distributed energy resource programs. These programs are based on state policy to promote the establishment of a reliable, efficient, and diversified portfolio of distributed energy resources throughout the state. And this is just meant to capture the incremental costs or the costs to deploy these programs. And a distributed energy resource is just an energy resource that's going to connect to the grid like a renewable energy facility, managed loads such as EV charging, energy storage like batteries, and other programs intended to incorporate renewable generation resources. And per statute, the utility is allowed to recover the cost to implement these programs. And statute also gives an annual cap for residential customers of $12. And the next one I want to discuss with y'all is the rider adjustments and the summary of rider adjustments. Now, a rider is just a mechanism that's going to allow the utility to recover or refund yearly without a rate case. And this rider adjustment contains two riders, the energy efficiency or EE rider and the excess deferred income tax rider or EDIT. Uh, just a high level, the EDIT rider is going to give you the money back, while the EE rider is going to be something you're paying into. Now, EDIT is just when a utility is coming in for a rate case at a higher corporate tax rate, what the utility needs to pay this tax rate is going to be included in rates. When the corporate rates cut prior to the utility coming back in for a rate case, then the utility is still collecting the higher corporate tax despite its actual tax bill being lowered. And generally, this is going to flow back to consumers. So, for example, if the tax rate is 35%, but the utility only ends up paying 1, this is looked at as an overcollection, and the commission is generally going to rule to return it. And for Duke Carolina's customers, the EDIT flowback is putting downward pressure on your power rates, but it's going to run out by 2026, causing an increase in rates. And then the other rider, the energy efficiency rider, you may have seen things, and I pointed out something on the first page of your bill about energy efficiency offerings for the utility. This rider allows the recovery of those costs as well as certain incentives for utilities. For example, of the EE programs, each utility is probably going to offer something related to water heaters, HVAC, possibly windows, door replacements, and so forth. And then one thing I don't have listed on the slides, but I want you to kind of look forward to in the future is we do expect another potential rider, which would be related to the nuclear production tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're hoping that's going to result in a flow back of money towards customers once it's included in rates. And the last thing I want to go over on this page 3 of your bill, just in a different table, is these municipal fee or franchise fee. You might also see taxes. And all this does is it allows the utility to recover costs associated with using the local government's public right of way. Kind of think of this as the utility paying rent to use the city or local municipality's land. Then the utility is going to pass this rent charge through to customers through this municipal fee. The municipal fee is going to be approximately 5% of the sum of the items above in the table that we saw on the last slide. And this wraps up what we're going to go over on the bill, but there is one more miscellaneous billing charge I want to cover that doesn't apply to Duke Carolinas yet, but likely will in the future. So some of the Duke Progress customers may already know about storm recovery charges. What a storm recovery charge is it's meant to pay the costs for severe weather events that the utility experienced in the past. Storm securitization is relatively newer in South Carolina, and Duke Progress was the first utility to do so. And this charge is one that can fluctuate. It's intended to pay the costs, the principal, and interest of a securitized bond that was taken out by the utility. And the fluctuations in this charge are going to occur if power usage doesn't match what they project as the monthly use. So for example, if a month is hotter or colder than expected, then energy use numbers may be different than the projection. So they could over or under collect, and that's going to be remediated. And the reason I do want to point out this charge is because we do expect customers in the upstate are probably going to see a charge like this based on Helene, and they may see this within a year. And what securitization kind of is, just so if you're wondering what that is it's just a way to make sure that when the utility's issuing debt, that we can try and get a cheaper rate than normal. And it's intended to result in a cheaper way to pay for storm recovery than traditional rate making. So with that out of the way, I want to briefly discuss how you can save money on your bills. And I primarily want to highlight some of the energy efficiency offerings in your bill. And like I said a few slides ago, you're paying for this as a customer, so you should be generally aware of what's available for you. And I want to start with something like the Dominion Energy Analyzer tool. And depending on your utility, your meter, and the time at your current residence, you may or may not have access to something like this. But I am aware of something very similar for Duke Energy. And these are really great tools to help you see where you're using the majority of your power. And I would highly recommend using something like this if you're considering an alternative rate structure to traditional rates, which we're going to talk about one of those alternative rate structures later with demand charges. But here you can see just kind of the categorized charges to help you understand what is in your monthly draw. And on the next slide, I'm going to have examples of what could possibly go into some of these categories. But I do want to point out this always on category just because it can be a little bit confusing. But if you've ever heard someone tell you to unplug things like a coffee maker when you aren't using it, and that's because these appliances will draw background power when not in use. So that's just what that always on portion is representing. So if you use that energy analyzer tool and you saw a high usage in a certain category, you can begin to think about how you can change usage patterns to achieve savings. And a general rule is if the appliance heats up or cools down, it's probably going to use a decent amount of power. So once you get to there, you can start to ask yourself, is there anything I can change? Am I running laundry every day? Could I run it once, maybe twice a week instead? Am I taking long showers with hot water? Could I potentially shorten that? Am I running space heaters? Could I potentially use central heating instead? Could I use possibly get a more energy efficient air conditioning system or fridge? Could I possibly turn up the thermostat by 1 degree for cooling or 1 degree down for heat? Uh, there are studies that show that changing the thermostat by a singular degree is estimated to save around 1 to 3% per degree per 8 hour period. And then just the last thing I want to mention with this slide is that these numbers generally are just going to show average power use for these common appliances. Please don't consider these appliance usage numbers as perfectly matching your appliances, but more as just a reference to see what appliances may draw more power. And this will be available for you if you download the slides. And then the last thing I want to go over for saving money on your bill is just some offerings from the investor owned utilities. So generally, you can get a free home energy audit from your utility just upon request. And there may also be potential rebates available for certain devices and appliances. And I've given links on this slide to all of the EE web energy efficiency web pages for you to use. If you're a co-op customer, there's likely programs available for you as well. Now I want to move into some topics that some of you may have heard about, others of you may not. Some of you may already be paying demand charges. But we're going to jump into these kind of using Santee Cooper's recent rate increase as an example. And I want to talk about these just because they can be really confusing and it's going to make your bill different than any of the prior examples I've shown. And if you have demand charges in your bill, I would love to hear your opinion on how they've worked for you, and feel free to provide those in comments. So before we jump into Santee Cooper's as an example, I do want to give a little background on demand charges. And I want to touch on what a load curve and what peaks are, just so you can kind of understand the theory behind them. So on the right here, you're going to notice what's called a load curve. And this simplified version represents the average load curve you're going to see in the southeastern US. And as you can see in yellow, our summer is near the 3 to 6 p.m. range, and that's where the peak is in the graph. And that's also your overall system peak for the year. Now, what's happening here is this is when people are generally getting home from work, kids are home from school, and you're probably about to cook dinner. You may be doing miscellaneous errands around the house. And then if you look at the winter data in blue, you're going to see two peaks. You're going to see a morning peak right here and an evening peak. Now that evening peak is going to be for similar reasons to this summer evening peak, but the winter peak is just generally when people are waking up with their heat on, getting ready for work, school, and so forth. But with this winter peak, it is important to remember that while it's lower than any of the summer peak, it's important to remember that there are some generation resources that are still not producing power at this time, such as solar, and that can lead to concern on the utility end for the peak. And the main reason I'm going over the peaks right now is because it's more expensive to produce power at these peak times because you're going to need to turn on more units to meet the rising demand. And this is where demand charges kind of come in. They're meant to lower this peak and ideally save system costs and just flatten this curve. And with that background out of the way, I'm hopeful we can get into the meat and potatoes of the Santee Cooper demand charge. So Santee Cooper began using a residential demand charge for bills coming out on or after April 1st. So if you're a Santee Cooper customer watching this, you've probably already received your first bill with these. Certain co-ops or municipalities may also use these charges. And if you have these charges, you really need to understand how these work. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the demand charge, which you might notice instead of being based in kilowatt hours, like the energy charge right below it, it's based in kilowatts. So that means you need a time period to make this charge work. And that's what these peak demand time windows are below. And you'll see that Santee Cooper has a summer time period, which goes from April to October, 3 to 6 p.m. And they have a winter time period, which goes from November to March, from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. These time periods are where that demand charge is going to look at because those are the peak on the system. But it's not going to look at the whole month. It's going to look at your maximum hour within that whole month within these time windows. So for example, let's say it's September and within the hours of 5 to 6 on September 10th, I used the most power or had the most demand, then this is the time frame that my demand charge is calculated out of. And we're going to go over an example on the next slide, just using fake numbers, just to kind of show you how this works in your bill with your basic customer charge and your energy charge. So with this walkthrough, I want to create just this fake customer. We're going to call him Beamer. He's going to use a lot of power during his peak hours. And I'm going to use these Santee Cooper numbers in our example just for costs, just so you can get a rough feel for them. Don't think of the kilowatt hour usage numbers with the appliances as exact, and they're just going to be a rough estimate. But we can go ahead and start before we get into any of our more of our example and just list our basic facilities or basic customer charge, just because that's not changing, that's going to be fixed. Beamer is going to pay this regardless of any usage. And then we can kind of walk into, well, what was Beamer's peak? So let's say again, September 10th, Beamer's getting home from practice at 4:30. He's just using tons of appliances. And this is his worst day for demand usage in the whole month. And his high usage is occurring between 4:30 and 5:30. And in that hour, Beamer uses his fridge, his air conditioner, his washer, his dishwasher, his oven, and a space heater. So then we're going to add all these together, and we're going to multiply that usage by the 1 hour, and we'll get the 8.3 kilowatts. Then we're going to multiply that 8.3 kilowatts by the demand charge of $8. And we'll see that Beamer's total monthly demand charge is right here, and it's $66.40. Now, I'm hoping at this point, a few of you are already thinking of ways that Beamer could lower this monthly demand charge, possibly by moving uses or cutting certain appliance usage. And that's a good line of thinking. And now we're going to move into the next slide just to see kind of how this interacts with the energy charge. So let's assume that despite Beamer being wildly inefficient with demand charges, he still uses your average 1,000 kilowatt hours per customer. Now we can just grab our energy rate, which is going to be found in the Santee Cooper tariff or rate plan, and we can multiply this value by our usage number, which you can see right here. And you can see that Beamer's usage charge is $79.20. So then if we want to get the power price absent any of these riders or miscellaneous taxes, we can just add all of these together and end up with a power bill price of $165.60. And I hope this helps some of y'all that might not be understanding demand charges. But I do want to remind you to please understand that I intend this as a simple demonstration. And I've omitted certain of these charges that might be on your bill and focus on the big ones. If anyone's still confused, please feel free to ask questions about that and we'll address it at the end, which that also brings us to our question slide, which if you have questions, go ahead and start typing them now. There are a few useful resources that I do want to point out at the end of the presentation that are available for you if you download this presentation. So for starters, I just want to point out this billing problem slide and just kind of your steps if you have a billing issue. And your first step is always going to be to contact the utility. If the utility can't help you, call ORS, Consumer Services Department. If it's still unresolved and unsatisfied, you can file a formal complaint with the Public Service Commission. And if you do that, you can choose to hire an attorney or represent yourself. I've given you the pro se litigant guide in case you're trying to represent yourself. And I do want to point out that the department's Consumer Services Division here may be able to assist with billing issues for co-ops, municipal entities, and Santee Cooper through its voluntary mediation process. But please attempt to resolve with your provider first. I also want to just point out, I have this slide where I've put together some useful links, your rate plans, informational links such as Santee Cooper, which includes a video on demand charges, the department's webpage, Office of Regulatory Staff resources, Public Service Commission resources, and some miscellaneous resources if you would like to learn more. And if you want to learn more about what the department does, you can request our publications and they'll be sent to you free of charge. And that includes Ditch the Pitch, ID theft prevention, and a credit report guide. And we also have much more. And they're also available on our website. You can also connect with us on Facebook, X, or Twitter, and YouTube. And here's my information. But with that, we'll move into any of your questions that we might have. And we may have another person on the advocacy team assisting us with questions, and that's Roger Hall.
Yeah, so it looks like we mostly just had some comments about people that did have demand charges. We do have, so hopefully what Jake was able to cover there was helpful to you. And as Santee Cooper, more customers start to see that, we have expected to get some more comments on it. We had one person comment about increase in the bill compared to the prior year. I think there's a couple of reasons there. Obviously, that demand charge. So hopefully what Jake covered will give you some ideas about reducing that. I think overall the rates did increase as well. So part of that is just going to be generally higher bills.
And then we have one question about late fees regarding Santee Cooper and whether Santee Cooper is different from investor-owned entities. And yes, Santee Cooper is different than these investor-owned utilities. Santee Cooper is a more akin to a municipal. It's a state-based power producer. And then we also have a question about the peak demand being sampled once per hour or every minute. That peak demand is going to look at just essentially if you were plotting out your usage in that time period, it's going to look at that, like whatever's going to be the peak. So that's one of the reasons why Santee Cooper, I know some of their messaging has been stagger, don't stack. And what they're trying to say there is like kind of stagger some of these uses. And that's how you can kind of save money if you can during these demand windows. And I know they can be a little tough, but that's your best way to try and work through them and just kind of set your bill self right and get your bill as cheap as you can. But with that, we're wrapping up. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to quickly add them in. Otherwise, please feel free to email me. Sorry for jumping with the slides. Feel free to email me here, which you can see my email, and we can hopefully try and answer anything you don't understand. Thank you very much.